Now, there's two schools of logic. She went to Harmonia first, or she was at Battle Creek, Michigan first. At one point, she was in Harmonia. We don't know which came first, chicken or the egg. However, when I read up on Sojourner Truth, she didn't see spiritualism as a religion. She saw it as a way of being. She did not, she's like, of course I'm a spiritualist, I agree. She did not see it like it was separate than her entity. It was who she is. Her religion was Quaker, but she was a spiritualist at heart. Catherine Seals was a healer who found her own spiritualist church a few years after Leafy Anderson, the Church of the Innocent Blood, in 1922 in New Orleans. She was a trumpeter. When Catherine Seals came into finding her church, she was poor and she was destitute, she didn't know what to do, and she was sick, and she asked for help, and they like shooed her away. Someone needed a healing, and she was able to heal them. From that point on, she became known as a healer. Again, in her church, she incorporated, like Leafy Anderson, the Catholic iconography and the hoodoo, the voodoo into it. And there is a difference between voodoo and hoodoo. We can go into that later. Marie Laveau II. I know she is a voodoo priestess, her and her mother. However, Marie Laveau, who practiced root work, conjure, Native American, and spiritualism, as well as Louisiana, or what is known today as New Orleans voodoo, she used to sit at the tables with Henri Gray and J.D. Valmore. She was a common participant in the spiritualist seance circles that they held at the time in New Orleans. J.B. Valmore, which is not his real name, it was the name he went by, known as a healing medium. He ran seance circles in New Orleans during the 1850s. And the reason why it's brief is because it's really hard to get information on him. However, when Emma Harding went down to New Orleans to do one of her speaks, she saw him outside before she went inside to do her lecture. And she walked up to him and said, "Oh my God, you are powerful." She had no idea who he was. He was actually a blacksmith by trade, and he held spiritual circles every week. His were open circles. Anybody and everybody could join. Him and Louis got in a kind of argument about it because Henri was like, "No, it should be closed." He's like, "No, I want them open." So he started that's why Henri went off and did a separate circle, because he wanted to close circles. And Valmore continued to do open circles. He was also the most sought after healers in New Orleans by all people, from the north to the south, the east, the west. He would heal people they would come to his blacksmith shop, he'd put down whatever he was working on, and he'd just go ahead and heal them, and then go back to work. And those are just some of the people that I was able to put together. Obviously, I keep digging and I can find more. But back to the top. After slavery ended, there was now a great deal of people interested in practicing religion that more closely mirrored the beliefs that they had been raised in. Modern spiritualism provided that outlet. Modern spiritualism embraced the basis of a good number of African Americans' beliefs, belief in the continuity of life and communicating with those who had transitioned to obtain guidance, wisdom, and comfort. Unfortunately, while slavery may have ended, racism had taken hold of the country. While blacks were no longer enslaved or believed they should be enslaved, there was also belief that they were still inferior as a result of slavery to the white majority. The Jim Crow era would usher in laws and policies to reinforce and marginalize the African Americans. It is during this period that spiritualism, whose membership was growing by leaps and bounds, but who was despised and looked down upon by mainstream America, that eventually, in a desire to protect their rights to be allowed to practice their religion, many would succumb to the belief that by removing their colored members from the organization, it would provide them the legitimacy they sought. Thus, between 1920 and 1930, a committee of folks was created to determine what to do about the Negro problem. There were three arguments for why they wanted separation. The Number one was allow spiritualists to hold the annual NSA conventions in fancy hotels like the Waldorf Astoria, which at the time prevented blacks from being able to be in the room. Spread their religion to segregated South. They believed that the Jim Crow era of segregation was fait accompli. That was going to be the way the world was going to be. This is how we were going to live the rest of our life. So the best way to get those fine gentlemen from the South who may not like to share space with blacks or people of color, we separate our religion, and we will have a white version of spiritualism, and we will have a white team missionary, a black missionary group for the blacks in the South. Finally, it was contributed to the advancement of black spiritualists, both within the religion and beyond. They believed that by separating, that blacks would be able to go further with their spiritualism and still carry their primitive, ancient ways of doing things without it marring the respectability of the white spiritualists. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about with the conjure, the root workers, the healers, the circles. It was believed that those practices that Africans brought with them back from slavery of practicing were the low-level mediumship, low-level spiritualism, and that they were higher because they were white. Mm-hmm. They were higher and more connected to true spiritualism. As a matter of fact, there was plenty of talks about, it was a hard chapter to read, let me tell you. That when you transition into a white spirit. That your time here on earth with my color skin was bottom of the barrel. Eventually you'll get to us, and there was the paternal, you're doing me a favor because you will guide and teach me to help me to become whiter like you. With many debates, heated arguments, and discussions at the conventions over the years, in 1926, the NCSAC was born, the National Colored Association of Spiritualist Churches. During this time, a number of African Americans who did not feel that spiritualism was welcoming branched out and began the separate mini spiritual movements. Those storefront windows, there was tons of them. They would go off and just do their own thing. That embraced their traditions that were passed down, while merging the religions that were forced upon them and staying connected to their roots. Because they would bring in the Christianity, but they would still do like Leafy Anderson did, like Catherine Blood did, merging in the Catholic iconography that everybody held dear, as well as their voodoo roots. By 1930, the NSA had introduced 3 amendments that would effectively segregate the colored spiritualists from their white counterparts. At the 1930 convention, the following amendments were made. Number 1, forbid state auxiliaries from granting charters to a local society made up in whole or in part of persons of colors of African descent. Number 2, prevent persons of colored African descent from being voting delegates at national conventions. Number 3, forbade societies directly or indirectly associated with the NSA, a majority of whose members belong to the Caucasian race, to admit members of person of color of African descent. Now, why colored African descent? Because we all assume that when you say colored, you're talking about all black people. No, at the time, colored was applied to anyone who was not of European descent or Anglo-Saxon descent. So that meant Native Americans, that meant Asians, that meant Middle Easterns, that meant you name it. By specifying African descent, they were very clear. If your skin was dark and you were of an African descent, because you can have pale skin and be of African descent. By specifying it, they were very clear about who was not allowed at the table. As we know today, as we sit here and I'm looking out on a diverse crowd, we obviously got over ourselves. Today we have a number of African Americans who are still practicing their spiritualism. From the these are outside of spiritualism. From the Ausora sect, I actually went and sat with them for 6 weeks. They gave a beginning class. Soa said it's the Egyptian religion, primarily focused on teaching spiritualism through the Egyptian belief system and their religion that they had during the time of Egypt. So I got the pleasure or the honor of sitting with them for 6 weeks and learning what their beliefs were. And lo and behold, it's the same thing. While they may have used different terminology, there are 9 points, 9 principles. While they believed in a God, you could become that God by traveling through the 9 principles. The only slightly difference is that they use cards to bring spirit, to bring you messages about your life. They do talk about life path and life planning, but from what I understand, a while ago, we used to do that here in an SAC, in SAC at Morris Prep. They used to have those classes to chart your, what is it called, Stacey? Your spiritual journey?
I don't know.
I don't know, it was a while ago. They don't do it anymore, apparently they did it at some point. Their beliefs were amazingly similar to ours. The only difference was that this was a room full of black people who were teaching this because they knew that there was a hunger for their traditional belief system and carrying it forward. Another group of people are they call them Orisha. That you know about those. The Orisha religion, which is mostly in Cuba, South America, Haiti, and in the Caribbean. And that is carried from the Yoruba tradition, and that was brought over. And it has been the Santeria. That has been modified to reflect the population of the group of people in that time, but it is still a form of spiritualism. And I can't remember his name, but there was actually a spiritualist who was one of the head founders of that particular group now. But again, it's still, I got to read a lot and see a lot. But they hold circles as well. They do a whole practice, and there's a white table with the white sheets, and they bring in the spirit, and they do a lot of singing, and it's all very spirit-based. What all of these religions have in common, regardless of what we call them, is the belief in our spirit, that we are spirits, that we have ancestors on the other side who are there waiting to hear us and receive us, and to give us messages and guide us through our day. The common theme is the belief in the continuity of life, and that those who transition possess a wisdom and healing that we can attain through mediumship. That which separates us is more the terminology and the tools utilized to access these gifts, but it's the ultimate purpose is the same. And a short, because I'm a research addict. Yes, they probably should have a research anonymous group. Yes. I research, and I was still researching up until 2 days ago. And I was like, you gotta stop. You don't have that much time. The beauty of all of this that I found was that no matter the circumstances, no matter the roadblocks, no matter the challenges, no matter how high those walls were, every single person still pursued their belief in the spirit. They still pursued knowing it to their deepest cores. They would hide it, they would retranslate it, they would even die for it, but physically. But they still held on to it. So I conclude this by saying, let's remember that. Let's remember where we came from and where we were founded. I believe a lot of this was motivated by fear. Fear of change, fear of not being accepted, fear of not being loved, fear of not being wanted, fear of having to alienate another member of your family. We all know those fears. But we all know what being motivated by fear does, right? Mm-hmm. If we're motivated by love, while there will be those who may not understand the way we love, it is still love. And one day, they will understand it and they will thank you. As I thank my ancestors for persevering and bringing me to this point, we all should thank our ancestors and the